It's just a crazy position. And Magnus sacrifices his queen. Oh. Wow, this is some of the deepest opening preparation you'll have ever seen.
Magnus Carlsen is the greatest chess player of all time, and in this video, I'm going to show you how Magnus uses the Queen's Gambit opening to destroy Hikaru Nakamura, Alireza Firouzja, Anish Giri, and other top 10 GMs. But first, in game number 1, I'm showing you Magnus Carlsen's secret queen sacrifice in the Queen's Gambit accepted. He only uses this when he wants to absolutely obliterate his opponents. Now, in the first game here, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white. He opens 1d4, and then after d5, he goes c4, the Queen's Gambit. Now, this is one of Magnus Carlsen's favorite ways to play for an opening advantage as white. And in this game, his opponent is Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave. Maxime is a big expert in 2 lines as black against 1d4. That is one, the Grunfeld, and the second one he's very good at is the Queen's Gambit accepted with the move d takes c4. So if you want to play the Queen's Gambit like Magnus, you definitely have to know what happens if black simply takes the pawn on the c4 square. Now here, Magnus Carlsen has a couple of lines he plays as white. One is the idea of either e3 or knight f3 followed by the other move, and the other is the much more aggressive 2 or 3 e4, opening up the bishop on the f1 square to win back that pawn. Now Magnus does have that beautiful pawn center on d4 and e4. However, on the other hand, here, black has a number of different ways to get counterplay against white's setup, so it is a very double-edged idea, very ambitious, but you have to know what you're doing. Now, in this position, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave goes for the absolute main line as black. That is simply the move e5, breaking in the center. Now, the idea behind this move is obvious. If white takes on e5, then bang, queen takes d1, is going to trade the queens off the board. White's going to have to recapture with the king, and then his king can't castle. And overall, it's going to be a roughly level game, or black may even be able to fight for an advantage here as he still retains the option of castling on the king side or on the queen side. So instead of that, here after e5, Magnus Carlsen simply goes for the main line, knight to f3, continuing development, putting pressure on that pawn on the 5 square, and temporarily ignoring the pawn on the c4 square. Now, this is the strongest move, and it is connected with a sort of a long-term pawn sacrifice. Here, if black takes the pawn on the d4 square, Magnus Carlsen's plan actually is going to be bishop takes c4, then short castles, and simply ignoring that pawn on d4 for a while, maybe going bishop, queen b3, setting up threats with the bishop and the queen on this diagonal against f7. Now, instead of e takes d4, which is the main line for black, here Maxime goes for the other option, bishop b4 check, hitting the king on the e1 square, and now white has to block it, and the only good move is knight to c3. If instead white went, say, knight to d2, or bishop d2 here, for example, knight d2, then this pawn can be won on the d4 square, and it's very hard to win that pawn back. So instead, knight to c3, definitely the best option. Now here, both sides play a series of essentially forced moves. Here again, e takes d4 is not the idea. Instead, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave knows instead you go knight to f6, putting more pressure on that pawn on the 4 square. Of course, that knight on c3 is now pinned by the bishop, therefore knight takes e4 is a possibility. For example, if white wastes a move, knight takes e4 is playable, and the knight can't win back the knight as the bishop pins it to the king. So, obviously, Magnus is going to have to do something very correctly here. In the game, instead of winning that pawn on the c4 square, he goes knight takes e5, winning the e5 pawn, and then threatening either bishop takes or knight takes c4 on the c4 square there. So now black, e5 is the move, and here black is going to hang on to that extra pawn on the c4 square for a very long time. Now here, of course, e4 is still being threatened. Magnus Carlsen defends the pawn with f3, and now black castles. And now this is where the middle game really kicks in. Here, white has that very powerful pawn center, supported by the pawn on the f3 square. However, that pawn on f3 does hurt his development. His knight on e5 is a little bit awkward, and his dark squares around the king could be vulnerable. Now, black, on the other hand, he doesn't have as good control over the center. Of course, white currently dominating the center. However, black does have that pawn chain on b5 and c4. He has a lot of space on the queen side. His king is already castled, and his minor pieces overall are in pretty good squares. So, all this to say, we have a very double-edged position ahead of us. Now here in this position, Magnus goes a3, knocking back the bishop. Black goes bishop to a5. And now Magnus continues developing. Bishop to e3, just supporting that pawn on the d4 square. Now here Maxime, he has to get some counterplay going right away. He does that with the move c5, breaking on the queen side. Of course, c5 is pretty much the standard idea for black in all sorts of queen's gambit positions. The queen's gambit declined, and so on. If black can get c5 in and knock off that pawn on the d4 square, he's often going to have a very good game, and that's definitely true here. Now, in the game, Magnus Carlsen takes on c5. This is basically forced. If he plays a waiting move like, say, queen to d2, then black has the option of going queen to e7, followed by rook d8, and then the rook lines up with the white queen on the d2 square. That would get very, very ugly very fast. So instead, d takes c5 on the board. And now here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, he has the option of trading queens on the d1 square. But instead of that, he goes for a completely different idea, one that is incredibly strong. Queen to e8, hitting the knight on the e5 square. Of course, after d takes c5, that knight on e5 is now hanging. White has to do something about it, but here's the problem. Where is that knight supposed to go? Literally, the only square it can go to right now is g4, but you do not want to allow knight takes g4 damaging your pawn structure. That'd be a complete disaster. Now, what else can white do? If he goes bishop f4 or pawn to f4, that's going to create more weaknesses in his position, and he's going to have a hard time hanging on. So here, Magnus Carlsen knows that, and he jumps in with the queen to the d6 square. Queen d6. This is by far the strongest move in the position. However, it certainly has some drawbacks. Now that queen is in enemy territory, same with the knight. I mean, if the queen moves, the knight falls. Here, Magnus has to follow this up flawlessly, and he may even lose the queen in this kind of position. Maybe that's what he intended. Let's find out. Here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, bishop to e6. An excellent move. What's the idea behind this? Well, he's actually freeing up the c8 square for the queen. Here, Maxime, he wants to go queen c8, and then rook to d8, hitting the queen, and the queen may in fact be trapped. All right, let's see what happens. Magnus, castle's queenside. You don't see castle's queenside in the queen's gambit accepted very often, but here it's by far the best idea. Now black continues his idea. Queen to c8. Maxime threatening rook to d8 on the next move. That would trap the queen there. Now Magnus, knight takes b5. He is not slowing down with his strategy one bit in the queen's gambit opening. And now, can black go rook d8 right away? Well, it turns out it can, but it's not the strongest idea. If black were to do that, then knight takes c4 is actually very, very strong for Magnus Carlsen, and he's going to get a tremendous amount of compensation for the queen if black does take it. So instead here, in this position, a6 by Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave. He knows his queen's gambit accepted. Now knight d4 from Magnus, and then bishop c7. This is the new idea instead of rook d8. Now look at this queen on the d6 square. Where can it go? It literally has no squares besides e7, and that is not a particularly good place. That queen's going to get knocked off sooner or later there. So with that in mind, here, Magnus Carlsen, he just straight up gives up the queen. And now knight takes e6. What is Magnus Carlsen's idea? Well, here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, the Frenchman, he takes the queen on the d6 square, then rook takes d6, then finally f takes e6 from black, and Magnus Carlsen, he wins back one more pawn on the c4 square. Magnus now targeting the e6 pawn. Of course, black's going to have to defend against that threat, but let's slow down and take inventory here. Magnus Carlsen is down a full queen. What does he have in return for that? Well, he's got one minor piece and 3 pawns, and that is it. Well, the bishop pair as well, which does count for something. So Magnus here on paper down roughly 3 pawns or a full piece. But that is not the end of the story. Here, Magnus, look at his position. All of his pieces here, besides the rook on the h1 square, are in perfect squares, and that rook's going to come flying in. And beyond that, his queen has literally nothing that it can pick off. The rooks aren't very active. And this knight on the b8 square could actually be trapped momentarily if Magnus goes c6. Then the knight would have literally nowhere to go. So, let's see what Magnus Carlsen has in mind. First, MVL, the Frenchman, rook to e8, defends the pawn on the e6 square, and then c6, advancing the pawn and locking in the knight permanently. It's looking like Magnus Carlsen knows what he's doing with this queen sacrifice in the Queen's Gambit accepted. Now, rook to e7 from black. Then Magnus, the obvious move to me looks like rook hd1, but instead, bishop to b6, an even stronger idea. The threat now is rook to d8, hitting the king, and from there, things can get very ugly very fast as the knight controls the f7 square. Black may even have to give up a rook or a queen to defend against that threat. So, here, Maxime, he does the only thing he can. Knight to d7, giving up the knight to block access to that d8 square. Now c takes, knight takes, and here Magnus, he increases the pressure once again, this time with a knight jump to the c6 square. Knight to c6, of course. Hitting that rook on the e7 square, the rook is forced to go back, rook to e7, and now Magnus just retreats the bishop on b6. His bishop is worth way more than black's knight in this position. So, bang, bishop e3 on the board. Here, things have stabilized a little bit. Here, Magnus has those two bishops and two pawns in return for the queen. But more importantly, he has tremendous compensation. Once again, black's queen doing very, very little. And all of white's pieces so far, except for the rook on h1, which is coming into the game, are on excellent squares. All right, now, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, he is a big expert in this Queen's Gambit accepted line. What's he going to do from here? Well, he starts queen c7, simply putting pressure on that rook on the d6 square. Now white, rook hd1, bringing in the rook, and knight to f8 from Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, just further supporting that pawn on the e6 square. Now from here, both sides make a couple of simple prophylactic moves. King b1 for Magnus, then king to h8 for Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave. And then here, Magnus, h4, expanding on the king side. This kind of move wasn't necessary, by the way. For example, here, Magnus can slowly improve his position with, say, king to a2, bishop b3, perhaps knight to e5 at some point. So h4 was not necessary, but Magnus does have a very specific idea here. In this position, Maxime goes h6, a very logical-looking move. The idea, perhaps, king h7 at some point, giving his king a little bit more loft, trying to clamp down on that g5 square in advance of Magnus potentially going g4 to g5. But here, Magnus, he doesn't slow down one bit. g5 on the board, g4 on the board, Magnus just going for it. Now, the threat here is, of course, g5, trying to blow open lines against the black king. If that happens, black's going to be in a lot of trouble. So, Maxime, he spots the threat. Queen to f7, shooting the queen over to the king side. His idea, potentially queen to f6, then threatening queen takes h4, trying to win the pawn, trying to slow down white's attack. So now Magnus, knight to e5, hits the queen. The queen goes to the f6 square. Again, lining up with that pawn on h4. Now if white goes g5, that is an option. But instead here, bishop d4, defending the pawn on the d4 square and hitting the queen on the f6 square. Now, of course, beyond that, the queen is also threatening the knight on the e5 square. Therefore, ideas like g5 from Magnus are not possible yet in this Queen's Gambit accepted position. So instead, bishop d4 from Magnus defends the pawn on the e5 square and lines up with the queen. Now, of course, the drawback of this move is Magnus gives up the pawn on the h4 square, but in return, he can win the pawn on e6 for tactical reasons. It's a little bit complicated. Here's why. Of course, way back in this position, that pawn on e6 is defended by the rook and the knight. However, what Magnus Carlsen is doing here with the move bishop takes e6 is capitalizing on the very vulnerable placement of the queen and the king on the h8 and the h4 squares. Of course, knight g6 is always a threat if the knight moves. So, for example, bishop takes e6 was played in the game. Here, black goes knight takes e6, then bang, knight g6 forks the king and the queen. Now, instead, rook takes e6 is just as bad. White can win back the rook. Then again, if black takes the rook, bang, knight g6 wins the game on the spot. So, Maxime, he spots this. His first priority is getting his queen or his king off these, vulnerable squares here. So, bang, queen to h2 on the board. An excellent idea. Maxime activating the queen a little bit more, putting some pressure on the knight on the e5 square. eyeing the b2 square and also eyeing the vulnerable c2 square. Now, if black were to get off, say, rook to c8 or rook a7 to c7 at some point, yes, the bishop blocks that. I see that, chess YouTube. I haven't missed that. But if black is able to get that off, then bang, queen to c2 check is going to be a very big threat. So now, Magnus Carlsen, bishop d5 on the board, excellent move, putting pressure on the rook on the a8 square. However, the problem is it does give up access to c8. Now here, rook a to c8 is possible. Maxime doesn't go for it just yet. Instead, king to h7 on the board, again, getting out of all sorts of nasty knight checks from the white knight. And now Magnus, he simply goes for it with the move g5. This is a very interesting decision. Of course, that rook on the a8 square is vulnerable right now. Magnus has the option of winning it outright. For example, bishop takes a8 is very playable. But the problem with this idea, and I think the reason Magnus didn't go for it, is if white takes the rook, then black takes back. And without that light-squared bishop, without that bishop pair, a lot of white's attacking potential in this position is simply lost, and black may start to take over as soon as he gets his rook on the c8 square and brings his knight back into the game. So instead of that, g5 on the board, the benefit of this move is Magnus keeps all of the tension in the position. He's a big fan of doing that, especially in these queen's gambit positions. And now he's simply trying to open up the h-file. For example, if black plays the move h takes g5, then his king is going to be super vulnerable on h7. Now, rook a c8 from black, eyeing the c2 square with the rook and threatening queen to c2 check. That would win the rook on the d1 square on the spot. So Magnus has to react. Rook c6, blocking the c-file with his own rook and offering a rook trade. Now Maxime accepts. Rook takes, bishop takes, and then Maxime plays a very gutsy move. H takes g5. He opens up the h-file, winning yet another pawn. Now here in this position, black is up roughly 2 pawns. It's a little bit complicated. Black has the queen, white has the bishop pair, and 1 more pawn. Overall, that's worth roughly 2 extra pawns for black. However, the bigger factor in this position, again, is going to be king safety and the activity of the pieces. So far, white staying very, very active in this queen's gambit accepted position. Now, of course, taking the pawn was not completely necessary. For example, a potentially stronger idea may have been simply h5. The idea being, you just want to push your h-pawn down the board while keeping the h-file closed, and you have that pass pawn as a huge asset throughout the game. Instead, after h takes g5, of course, you don't have a pass pawn yet, and white does have the open h-file, and that could cause huge problems for black later in the game. Now here, Magnus, the move for him is bishop to f7. He's putting pressure on that rook on the e8 square. However, the drawback of this move is that bishop on f7 could be a little bit misplaced throughout this game. Now black goes rook c8, pressuring the knight. And now before defending the knight, Magnus actually goes bishop to e5, a slightly dubious move. It is very creative. The bishop is being supported by the knight for now. Therefore, bishop e5, hitting the queen on the h2 square is possible. Now, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, the Frenchman, the queen's gambit accepted expert. He goes queen to g2, then knight d4 from Magnus, getting the knight out of the way of the attack of the rook. And finally, here black plays a brilliant move, g4, a deflection move. The idea being you want to deflect that f3 pawn away from the f3 square, weakening white's pawn chain here, and making that e4 pawn vulnerable to the queen from the g2 square. So how is white going to defend? Well, Magnus takes the pawn. Black takes the pawn with check on the e4 square. So far, it looks to be heading Maxime's way. Now king to a2, and then rook d8, increasing the pressure on the knight on d4. Now, very importantly, the bishop on the e5 square was not hanging. If Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave took it with the queen, queen takes e5, the problem with this move is you give up control of the h1 square. Of course, the queen on e4 controlled it, and now white has a mate in 2. Rook h1, and then the only way to stop mate, of course, the bishop on f7 controlling the g8 and the g6 squares. The only thing black can do is queen to h2, and then rook takes h2 as checkmate. So you definitely don't want to allow that as black. So heading back to this crazy queen's gambit accepted position. Now black goes rook d8, increasing the pressure on the knight. Of course, rook takes d4 may be a threat later. Now, rook f1. This move defends the bishop in advance, and a very clever move, again setting a trap. If black takes on d4, for example, rook takes d4, you take with the bishop, and again, the queen cannot move as it needs to stay on e4, defending the h1 square. If it moves, then rook h1 is checkmate. So you cannot allow that. Instead, queen g2 is the move from Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave. Excellent move, putting pressure on that rook on the f1 square. Now Magnus, rook to f5. Magnus, a very cheeky idea, simply threatening rook to h5 checkmate in one move. Now, Maxime defends, g6, controlling the h5 square, stopping rook to h5 ideas. And Magnus goes rook to f6, taking advantage of that new weakened square. Pawn's no longer on g7 defending that, so bang, rook h6 on the board. Now Maxime spots the idea of queen takes g4. The pawn's now vulnerable, so he grabs his queen, picks up that vulnerable pawn. And here Magnus makes a very big mistake. Overall, these checkmating ideas on the h-file are being stopped, primarily due to the g6 move by black. Here Magnus has to think defensively. He has to go bishop b3 or something similar, trying to consolidate his position. All of his pieces are kind of coordinated very strangely here. Instead of that, he goes knight to f3, and this move turns out to be a very big mistake. Here, the Frenchman, Maxime, rook d3, increasing pressure on the knight, also controlling the b3 square. This means there are going to be various back rank ideas, queen g1, for example, may be coming up in the near future. Now, bishop d5 from Magnus defends the knight on the f3 square with the bishop, and then rook takes d5, takes the bishop, but of course Magnus has an idea. Rook to f7, then king to h6, bishop g7, king h5, and then rook takes f8, finally winning back that lost piece. Now here, Maxime, he is still up material. He's up roughly a piece, and now that there are less pieces on the board, Magnus Carlsen no longer really has chances to attack the black king. So let's see what happens from here. Can Magnus turn this game around, or is it just impossible for him to do that? Queen c4 on the board. It's the king. Magnus goes b3, blocking the attack. Then queen to e2, forking both the knight and the king. Of course, the knight currently defended by the rook on the f8 square. However, Magnus under a lot of pressure. Now, bishop b2 on the board, defending the check, getting the bishop back to a good square on b2. But then king g4. Maxime with the king march, increasing pressure on the knight. Here, Magnus goes a4, and this is Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave's idea. He does the reverse queen sacrifice. Queen takes f3, giving up the queen for just the bishop, just the knight on f3, and the rook once Magnus takes back. Giving up the queen for a knight and a rook, but here's the idea. He still has more than enough material, the rook being much better than the bishop in the endgame, and most importantly, this passed pawn on the g6 square, there's nothing stopping it on the g-file. Now Magnus tries to fight back, but Maxime, he just pushes the pawn down the board and down the g4. Magnus attacks the rook. King e4 defends the rook. Now Magnus' one chance is pushing this pawn on the b4 square to b5, and then trying to promote, but Maxime's on top of it. A takes, then g3, pushing the pawn once again. Magnus b6, but Maxime doesn't slow down. g2, b7, the last-ditch effort from Magnus. But then Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, rook d8, defends the b8 square, stopping b8, promoting to a queen. g1 promoting to a queen is happening next. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he is forced to resign on the spot to Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave. Magnus Carlsen's secret queen sacrifice not quite working out well in this game, but it's still an unbelievably good idea, not to mention shocking. All right, diving into our second game here, we have Magnus Carlsen versus Hikaru Nakamura, and we're going to head for a Queen's Gambit structure. We're doing it via a slightly different move order here. Your black does go d5 in the spirit of the Queen's Gambit decline, and finally Magnus d4. So now here on move 4, we transpose to basically a 4 knight to c3 Queen's Gambit decline structure. This is the 3 knights variation of the Queen's Gambit decline. Of course, white having those 2 knights on c3 and f3, and black the one on f6. And nowadays, this is the main starting position of the Queen's Gambit. This is the position we see over and over in top grandmaster games. Now here, black has a wide variety of options. The old main line is bishop b7, but there's a ton of other ideas we're also going to see in this video, including the Rogozin with bishop b4, the semi-Tarrasch with c5, the semi-Slav with c6, and even in this game, we're going to cover a different option, d takes c4, the Vienna variation. This is a move Hikaru Nakamura plays quite a bit, and it's also very popular with other top players. For example, Fabiano Caruana and Jan Nepomniachtchi also play this move. Now here, the main line for white is going to be e4, the idea being you just gain control of the center in the spirit of that e4 variation of the Queen's Gambit accepted we saw in the last game. Now, of course, white is threatening. Bishop takes c4, regaining the pawn. If he regains the pawn, then goes short castles and continues developing, he's going to have an absolutely dominant position. So here, black has to do something right away. Now, the old move here in the Vienna, or in the Rogozin, you can also say, is the move bishop b4, trying to pin the knight on c3, putting pressure on that e4 pawn, potentially setting up ideas like c5 and then queen to a5, putting more pressure on this diagonal here. Now, instead of that, there is a more modern idea. Yes, this move has been around for a very long time, but a lot of top grandmasters are starting to play it. That is the move b5. Now, the idea behind this move, obviously, you're stopping white from playing bishop takes c4. That is not a possibility as the pawn takes the bishop. However, this move allows white to play the move e5, hitting the knight, and then after the knight move, say knight d5, the main move, and the move Hikaru played in the game, then you can simply win the pawn on the b5 square, and once again threaten the pawn on c4. Now, here's the idea behind this whole variation. Here, black has the key move, knight to b6. This entire line depends on black being able to play this move here. Now, he is hanging on to that pawn on c4. Now, yes, the pawn on c4 is a doubled, isolated pawn. Of course, these pawns on the c-file are technically weak. However, that pawn on c4 does control a lot of squares. For example, that d3 square. It is stopping bishop d3 from white, and that does hurt his development. And beyond that, black also has a very simple plan for development. For example, bishop b7, knight c6, queen d7. He can even go long castles if he wants to, or castle on the king side, depending on how the game progresses, and depending on where the black king is going to be safer. So black's position, he does have those weaknesses on the c-file, but he also has a lot of dynamic potential. Now, what are white's ideas here? Well, we'll cover them as we go through the game here. White has two main options. Now here, Magnus simply goes a3, a very logical prophylactic move, stopping bishop b4 ideas in the future. Of course, this diagonal being very vulnerable for white, so very good idea trying to clamp down on that. Now Hikaru, knight to c6, continuing developing. Here, Magnus, bishop e3, very logical move. Now Magnus here has a couple of main ideas. He's going to continue developing likely queen c2 and rook d1. That is the optimal placement of the pieces. Of course, the rook defending the pawn on d4 and lining up with the black queen on d8. And then the queen on c2, simply eyeing that c4 pawn. However, beyond that, white's going to have two main options. One is going bishop e2 and short castles. It's going to be a very safe and solid idea. The other is going to be launching a kingside attack with the move h4 to h5, maybe even h6 if he's allowed it. And he's going to have other ideas like rook h3 to g3, pressuring that g7 pawn. So white here has some very interesting options. And in case you're really curious, the third option for white, instead of bishop e3, white even has this plan of queen d2 and then queen to f4, potentially trying to put pressure on the king side with the queen right away. But that's a story for another day. You could investigate that in your own games if you're really motivated by it. Now, in the game, bishop e3 from Magnus. Hikaru goes queen d7. Logical developing move. Again, the bishop belongs on this b7 square because this diagonal here is open for the bishop. Now, knight c3 for Magnus. A very good prophylactic move. Here in this position, the queen is technically eyeing the knight. There are going to be some lines in the future. Maybe black can go knight e7 trying to hit the knight on b5. Maybe even knight takes e5. So knight to c3, very good prophylactic move, just avoiding all of those tactics in the future. Very good human move. Hikaru goes bishop b7, again continuing development. Now Magnus queen c2, setting up the rook d1 idea. Again from there, the rook defending d4 and eyeing the queen on the d7 square. And the queen is better placed on the c2 square as it simply eyes the c4 pawn in the future. Now, knight to a5 from Hikaru. This move surprised me a little bit. The idea being he wants to permanently clamp down on that c4 pawn, and beyond that, the knight may want to go into the b3 square at some point. So knight b3 is going to be an option, and it also permanently stops any sort of b3 or b4 idea from white. Obviously, then c takes b3, and that pawn on b3 will be defended. So Hikaru just trying to clamp down on the queen side in this queen's gambit structure here. So knight to a5, very interesting move. Now Magnus rook d1, continuing the plan, and we're almost at the critical point where Magnus has to commit to a plan. Now Hikaru rook b8. Again, very interesting move from Hikaru. I think Hikaru is trying to throw Magnus off his game in this position. A more natural move would have been bishop e7. Bishop e7. We're going to see that in a little bit. The idea being just setting up short castling. There's no need to commit the rook to the b file yet. The rook may have wanted to go to d8. The black king may also have wanted to castle long in this position. But the idea behind rook b8 is if Hikaru eventually goes, say, bishop a6 or bishop c6, the rook could be very active on the b file. So, interesting idea. Now, both sides continue developing with their bishops. Magnus going bishop e2 and Hikaru going bishop e7. And now here we are at the critical position of the opening or the start of the middle game, however you want to look at it. Here, Magnus has to decide, do you want to play it safe and solid with the move short castles? There's nothing wrong with this move. Magnus still has a little bit of an advantage, but it's going to be a lot harder to attack the black king. Instead, he goes for the Alpha Zero inspired strategy, expanding on the king side with the move h4. Now, if you're not familiar with the term Alpha Zero, that was a very strong chess computer engine developed by Google in the year 2018. It used advanced AI programs, and it basically trained itself in the game of chess. It ended up beating Stockfish in a one-on-one match. And one of the big takeaways from Alpha Zero is that pushing the h-pawn down the board with moves like h4 and tending h5 to h6 is one of the strongest ways to attack the black position in just a whole wide variety of openings. So here, Magnus, his idea, literally keeping the rook on the h1 square and just ramming the h-pawn all the way up into the heart of black's position. So black here has the opportunity to stop the pawn permanently with the move h5. That is playable. However, that does weaken his king side permanently. For example, if black here, if white wastes a move, or to waste a move here, let's say queen d2, and then let's say black castles eventually. That pawn on the h5 square is now going to be undefended. It's going to be a lot harder to defend it. And if black ever goes g6 trying to control it, then moves like g4 are going to be super dangerous. So overall, the idea of h5 from black is very committal. Hikaru did not play it in the game. Instead, bishop c6. Now, this is part of his ongoing strategy with rook b8 and with knight to a5. Here, what Hikaru wants to do, he actually wants to go either knight to a4 or bishop to a4. And from there, if the bishop goes there, that bishop is going to skewer the queen on c2 and the rook on the d1 square. That's going to force some minor pieces off the board. Perhaps Hikaru can recapture with the queen, even trying to get the queens off the board. So if Hikaru managed to get the queens and some minor pieces off, that's going to greatly reduce white's attacking potential. But as we're going to see, whether the queens stay on forever or they come off, this h-pawn is going to be a thorn in black's position for the rest of the game. Now here, Magnus, he continues with the Alpha Zero inspired attack. h5, Prince Harry, the h-pawn, His Royal Highness, just marching up the board here. Now Hikaru continues his plan, bishop a4, try to offer that trade of the minor pieces. Now the knight takes the bishop, the queen takes the knight back, and now we have this potential trade of queens in this position. Now, this is only move 17. If the queens came off the board here, trust me, I would not have chosen this game for this video. You guys know me by now. I like peak chess with the queens on the board and wild attacking positions. That's what I like. So, queens definitely staying on the board here. Now, Magnus, he goes rook c1. Simply saying, if you want to trade queens, I'm going to trade back with the rook. Then I'm going to have pressure on that pawn on c4. So Hikaru, he doesn't go for it. He actually goes knight to b3, continuing the idea of knight to a5 that we saw earlier. Now knight b3, clamping down on the queen side. Obviously, the immediate threat of that move is it is hitting the rook on the c1 square, and now the rook's got to go somewhere. So, rook b1 in the game, then black goes queen a5, hitting the king. king to f1, and then the break c5 from black. Now, this is a very classical break in the Queen's Gambit or the Queen's Gambit decline. This is black's main way of getting counterplay in all sorts of these positions. So the idea, obviously, black trying to gain space and trying to liquidate these pawns on c5 and d4. Black can do that, then this pawn on the e5 square is going to be significantly weaker. Now, what does Magnus do about this? Well, taking on c5 is technically an option, but it is a lot weaker. Here, black can simply recapture with the bishop or the knight. Again, pawns coming off the board, white's pawn on e5 a little bit weaker, and overall, white's long-term attacking potential is reduced a little bit if he does that right away. So instead, here, Magnus goes for a different idea, h6. This is the full idea of that alpha 0 h-pawn. You want to ram the pawn all the way up to the h6 square, and then give black a very difficult question. Now, first of all, if you do nothing, if you say take on d4 or whatever else, then h takes g7 is absolutely devastating. Black's going to have to go rook g8. Then you can win the h-pawn if you want to. I mean, this just gets very, very ugly very, very fast. So here, black has to do one of two things. First of all, you can take on h6. That damages black's pawn structure permanently. That's going to be an absolute nightmare. For example, then bishop takes h6 and bishop g7 ideas are possible. That is not going to be good. Instead, the alternative, and the one Hikaru did in the game, is of course g6. Now, the problem with this move, as Hikaru played in the game, is it does permanently weaken all of these dark squares around the black king. That's the first problem. The second problem is if the white queen ever gets to the g7 square, I'm going to draw some imaginary lines here. If this ever happens, and yes, Chess YouTube, I'm aware the queen can't just do that with 5 moves in a row. Cry about it in the comments section if you want to. But if the white queen manages to pull that off, then it could be checkmate if the black king is ever castled on the king side. Now, the third problem with this move for black, from black's perspective, is if the black king castles on the king side, that king is going to be entombed forever. Obviously, f6 and f5 ideas would weaken the king side further as white has this pawn wedge on e5, and that means there's going to be all sorts of back rank mate threats. If, for example, if the rooks ever come off the back rank and the queen ever gets to c8 and there's no rook there to defend, that could be a back rank checkmating idea, and black's going to have to respect that for the rest of the game. So, sorry for taking so long to explain this, but this pawn wedge on h6 is just an insanely powerful idea for white. Now, here in this position, white takes on c5. Of course, black just went g6. It is white's move. Now the bishop takes, and then queen takes. So a bunch of simplifications, and here Magnus shows yet another idea of this move, h4 to h5 to h6. He goes rook to h4, activating the rook on the h-file. Brilliant idea. Now it's active on the 4th rank. It's eyeing the c4 pawn. White's actually threatening just bishop takes c4 straight up, and what's black going to do about it? In the game, Hikaru actually ignores the threat. He just short castles. Now, real fast, instead of this, the best move would have been rook to c8, defending the pawn on the c4 square. Now, why did Hikaru not do that? Well, let's find out. Short castles on the board. Now Magnus calls Hikaru's bluff. He goes bishop takes c4. Now Hikaru, rook f to c8. This is the idea. He thinks he can get some pressure going on this c-file. Of course, now if the bishop moves, then queen takes c2 ideas are going to be possible. So, what is Magnus going to do here? He just takes the knight on the b3 square. Bishop takes b3. And now, if black takes the queen, that is going to be a major blunder. Here's why. Queen takes c2, bishop takes c2, rook takes c2. Now, both sides have the pair of knights. However, white has 2 assets here that are just so incredibly strong. One is that pawn majority on the queen side. White's always going to be able to force through a potential passed pawn there. And beyond that, again, he has that pawn wedge on h6, meaning there are all sorts of back rank mating threats. For example, rook e4 to rook e8, if that rook ever moves off the 8th rank. And black's going to have to respect that for the rest of the game. So, just a terrible endgame for black here if he traded the queens. Now, instead of that, queen b5 on the board, hitting the king, forcing either a king move, like king to g1, or the move he played in the game, queen to e2, which is much, much stronger, forcing the queen to do something. Now, queen takes b3. That's the idea. Of course, queen to b5 here, hitting both the king and the bishop on the b3 square. So queen e2, queen takes b3, Then rook to b4, hitting the queen on the b3 square. Now the queen has to go somewhere. And by the way, this move rook b4, very, very strong. First of all, activating the rook. The rook on the h4 square doing very little. Rook on b4, very active. It also blunts black's rook on the b8 square there. And if white can get some rooks off the board, that's only going to make his one pawn advantage and that pawn wedge on h6 just that much more powerful. So very good idea. Now here black, how's he going to get counterplay? One option is queen d5, a very passive move. I mean, if you play this against Magnus Carlsen, that's going to be curtains. You just cannot let Magnus get this big of an advantage in the queen's gambit opening as white and expect to hang on. So instead, queen to a2 on the board for Hikaru, hitting the rook on the b1 square, trying to get counterplay. A very good idea, but let's see how it plays out. Now Magnus, rook d1, getting the rook over to the open d file. And again, we're seeing those back rank mating threats in action. If the rooks come off the 8th rank, bang, that's going to be a checkmate on the d8 square. So now black, a5, hitting the rook. Hikaru trying to get some counterplay. Magnus goes rook b5, solid move. Again, maintaining that tension with the rook on the b8 square and the rook being supported by the queen. And then a4, gaining more and more space and clamping down on the b3 square. So this is Hikaru's idea of trying to counterplay. Now, if these pawns eventually fall, that pawn on h4 would be extremely powerful, so that may be what Hikaru is banking on in this position. Now Magnus, queen to e4, centralizing the queen. And Hikaru finally goes queen to c4, virtually forcing the queens off the board. Of course, the queen on the c4 square, hitting both the queen on e4 and the king on the f1, so Magnus here being forced to capture that queen on c4. Queen takes, knight takes, and now we see the idea of keeping this rook on the b file from that maneuver rook h4 to b4 from a few moves ago. White trades the rook. Rook takes, and here, yes, black has some pressure on that b2 pawn. However, Magnus can basically ignore it. Rook d4, putting pressure on the knight. Now, of course, this is where that alpha 0 pawn comes into play. If black takes the pawn with the rook, then, but a bang, rook d8 hits the king. That is game over. That is checkmate. So, can't do that. What about knight takes b2? Is taking the pawn with the knight possible? Well, the answer is technically yes, but you don't want to do it, and here's why. The threat is simply knight to g5. Then white's going to go rook d7, ganging up on that f7 pawn. And again, rook b7 defending is impossible because bang, rook d8 is checkmate. So no matter how you take that pawn on b2, you get a terrible position or you get checkmated instantly. So with that in mind, here Hikaru goes rook c8, trying to defend the knight on the c4 square. But now Magnus, rook d7, increasing the pressure. Now, finally, black here can take on b2. That is what he does in the game. Knight takes b2. But then bang, knight g5 from Magnus Carlsen. Exactly what we're talking about. Ganging up on that ultra weak pawn on f7. And if that pawn falls, for example, a black wastes a move, say knight to c4, rook takes f7, then this pawn on the h7 square is going to fall, and from there, white's going to have that passed pawn on the h6 square. That passed pawn is just going to be escorted all the way to the h8 square. That is another advantage of this alpha 0 pawn. If the pawn in front of it falls, then the alpha 0 pawn is just 2 squares away from promoting, so that becomes a very powerful asset. So, heading back here. Instead of knight to c4, black defends. Rook to f8. Good move. Now, rook d4 puts more pressure on that pawn on the a4. Here, Magnus is basically just playing with his food. Imagine he's got a plate of food, and there's a little Hikaru dish, and he's just using his fork, just kind of pushing the food around, pushing Hikaru around, kind of waiting for him to make a mistake. Let's see if Hikaru can hang on. Rook c8. Rook f4, attacking that pawn a different way. Again, Magnus just playing with his little Hikaru dish here. Then rook c1, king e2, rook c2, king e3. Hikaru trying to give some checks here. But after rook d2, there are no more good threats. Black retreats the rook back to the c7 square. And then rook b4, threatening checkmate in one move. This forces the rook to go back sooner or later. First, Hikaru inserts the check on the c4 square. Knight to c4 check. Hitting the king on d2, king's got to move, king goes to e2, and now again, rook b8 is yet another checkmating threat with the rook and that alpha 0 h pawn. So, rook c8 trying to defend in this queen's gambit opening. Now, Magnus finally, he takes the pawn on the a4 square. Now, Magnus once again is up a clean pawn, that pawn on the a4 square, and between the better pieces, the extra pawn, the alpha 0 pawn, things are not looking good for Hikaru. Now, Hikaru does win back the pawn immediately. Knight takes e5, but here, Magnus just further increases the pressure. Rook to a7, putting pressure on f7, threatening f4, removing the defender of the f7 pawn, that being the knight on the e5 square. Now, knight g4 from Hikaru. Hikaru trying to get counterplay. Now the threat potentially is rook c2, and then rook or knight takes the f2 pawn. Of course, that'd be difficult right now because, again, there's rook a8 checkmating threats. But again, Hikaru, a tenacious defender, trying to get something going. Now, knight takes f7 from Magnus, winning the pawn. Rook b8, Hikaru trying to defend. Now, Magnus f3, knocking off the knight. If the knight moves, that is going to be curtains for black. So, rook b2 hits the king. King d3 getting out of the check. And here Hikaru gives a series of checks trying to put pressure on Magnus. This is his last-ditch effort. But Magnus, again, just playing with his little Hikaru dish here for dinner. Nothing that Hikaru can do is going to save this game. And here, despite giving the check on the d1 square with the knight, in this position, Hikaru resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen, even though it's Magnus Carlsen's move. There's simply nothing stopping, say, rook to h7, winning the pawn, then forcing through that alpha 0 h pawn. And for that reason here, in this position on move 50, in this Queen's Gambit opening game, Hikaru resigns to Magnus Carlsen. What a game. All right, diving into our third game. This game's incredible. It's Magnus Carlsen versus Alireza Firouzja from the Speed Chess Championships. Now, this is a Queen's Gambit game. However, we are going a slightly different move order once again. This is actually the standard move order to reach the Queen's Gambit decline nowadays. You go d4 and c4, black goes knight f6, and then e6. Then knight to f3, d5, reaching the Queen's Gambit decline. And here, of course, white has that option, g3 heading for a Catalan, or knight to c3, the old three knights variation that we saw in the last game. Now, in the last game here, Hikaru took the pawn on the c4 square. That was the Vienna. Of course, there are a ton of other lines we're going to cover in this game. We're covering literally all of them. Again, c6, c5, bishop b4, bishop e7. All of these are being covered in this video series. Now, in this game, Alireza Firouzja goes for the Rogozin variation. This line is becoming insanely popular at the highest level. For the last, 10, 15 years, it's been a big deal. Now here, white has three main options. C takes d5, bishop g5, and queen to a4. All of them are very strong. Ding Liren, the big specialist in the Queen's Gambit as white, is a big fan of the queen to a4 idea. But beyond that, c takes d5, and bishop to g5, as played in the game, are also equally popular. Now, this is arguably the absolute main line of the Rogozin. This is the old move. You're just trying to get the bishop outside the pawn chain, then go e3, bishop e2 or bishop d3, and short castle. So, very standard Queen's Gambit style play for white here. Now, in this position, the main move for black is going to be h6. With that, you challenge the bishop on the g5 square. You basically force through either bishop takes f6 or bishop to h4. Both of those lines have their own nuances. But instead of that, in this position, Alireza Firouzja goes for a completely different idea. He doesn't go h6. He actually goes knight b to d7. So with this move, he's reaching a line that could also be reached via the move order for knight b d7 instead of for bishop b4, the Rogozin variation. So here, black, he simply defends the knight on the f6 square, and he also supports the idea of an immediate c5 break, trying to liquidate some of the tension in the center. However, the drawback of this move is it doesn't really force white's hand. White can just continue developing with the move e3, as Magnus Carlsen played in the game. Again, this is a very, very standard idea in the Queen's Gambit and the Queen's Gambit decline. You get the bishop outside the pawn chain, then go bishop e2 or bishop d3, and finally short castle. So what is Alireza Firouzja going to do in this position? He goes h6, knocking the bishop. Obviously, now that the knight can recapture on the f6 square, for example, bishop takes, then knight takes. That was part of the idea of knight d7, so Magnus does not want to allow that. He does not want to give up his precious bishop pair that quickly. So instead, of course, the main move is going to be bishop to h4, keeping the bishop pair alive. Now here, black has a choice. The standard idea in the Queen's Gambit declined is going to be c5, just breaking on the queen's side. Now that move is a little more common when the bishop is way back on the e7 square, as from there the bishop is a little more defensive. It blunts the bishop on h4 a little better, and black's position is a little bit safer overall. Now instead of c5 here, Alireza Firouzja goes for a different idea, g5, the standard Rogozin or Nimzo Indian style idea. Now the bishop goes to g3, and then here's the key idea for black. Knight to e4, jumping in with the knight. Now, this is a very critical idea in this line. Of course, the bishop on b4, putting pressure on the knight on c3 and pinning it. And now the knight on the e4 square also ganging up on that knight. Of course, here, if white does absolutely nothing and wastes a move, let's say bishop e2, that would be a massive mistake. Here, black can take the knight on the c3 square, and after white takes back, bang, bishop takes c3, forking both the king and the rook on the a1 square. Now, this is not technically game over for white, as if black does part with his dark squared bishop, his king side is going to be super, super weak, especially with these pawns on the g5 and the h6 squares. However, obviously, black would have an advantage here with the extra exchange. White can't allow that. So, instead of bishop e2, what are white's options? Well, one idea is queen to c2, simply defending the knight on the c3 square with the queen. If knight takes, then b takes, the pawn is defended, and also putting some pressure on the knight. However, instead of that, Magnus goes for the absolute strongest idea, and it's a little bit counterintuitive if this is your first time seeing this Queen's Gambit decline structure. Knight to b2. Now, this move does two things. First of all, it blocks the pin on the knight on the c3 square. Second of all, it threatens knight takes e4, just trying to trade the knights and damaging black's pawn structure in the middle of the board. So now, the big question is, can black take the knight on the c3 square? Well, if he goes knight takes c3, that is a big mistake here. For example, b takes, bishop takes, yes, black wins a pawn, but the key difference here, the king is not in check. White can simply go rook to c1 in this position, hitting the bishop, then the bishop's got to go, and from there, white is going to have a massive initiative, thanks in part to his lead in development, and also black's very weak pawns on the king side. For example, h4 ideas are going to come very, very soon, trying to open up the h-file. So overall, this would be a disaster. And Alireza Firouzja, he knows that. Instead of going knight takes c3, he just goes knight takes g3, chopping off that bishop on the g3 square. This is the best idea. Of course, now you win the bishop pair, white only having one bishop, black having two. However, the drawback of this move is after h takes g3, suddenly this rook on the h1 square is actually very, very active. For example, if black castles kingside, then bang, you lose the pawn on the h6 square, and white's going to have a devastating attack. So that is not a possibility here. So with that in mind, what are black's ideas? How is he going to stabilize the position and blunt white's pressure on the king side? Well, black does have a few different options here. For example, taking on c4 is possible, but that does speed white's development up after bishop takes c4, so black probably shouldn't play that. Instead, black's going to have two main ideas here. One is c5, the standard Queen's Gambit declined idea, trying to increase the pressure on white's center on d4. And the other idea, and the move Alireza Firouzja played in the game, is c6, that semi-Slav move, getting that pawn triangle in the middle of the board. Now from here, white simply goes queen to c2. Magnus Carlsen has an idea, and you're going to see it in the next move. Here, Alireza Firouzja, he goes bishop f8. Now, this move is a little bit premature. Part of the idea is getting out of the way of a future a3 advance, so it's a little bit prophylaxis. Beyond that, it also wants to go bishop g7. From there, the bishop will be very well placed, and perhaps more importantly, it will defend the pawn on the h6 square, which means black can castle without losing the pawn to rook takes h6. However, again, this move is passive, and here Magnus shows part of his idea. He actually expands on the king side with the move f4. So Magnus making very good use of those double pawns on the g-file. Here, for example, if black were to take, then bang, g takes f4, white wins back the pawn, and he no longer has double pawns on the king side. He would have a crushing position. So taking on f4 is never going to be possible. However, if black doesn't do that, white's going to have this very powerful center, and he can actually go castling long in this position. You sometimes see long castles in the Queen's Gambit decline. It's a little bit rare, but in this position, it works out wonderfully. So black, bishop g7, continuing his plan, and here Magnus long castles. Now, the battle lines are being drawn. Black has to decide, do you want to castle on the king side entering a opposite sides castling sort of position, and from there launch an attack on the queen side with ideas like a5 and b5? Or do you want to continue developing your queen side and actually castle long? In the game, black actually goes for the latter option. He starts queen to e7, perhaps the best square for the queen, trying to cover those dark squares. Now king b1 for Magnus, and then knight to f6 for Alireza Firouzja. Again, freeing up that d7 square for the bishop, setting up long castles ideas. Now, I do want to point out, in this position here, the computer does find a much better idea. g4, try to lock down the king side, and from there, it's going to be a lot harder for white to get an initiative going. We're going to see this idea of g4 over and over in this game, so I do want to point it out right away. Now, instead, knight to f6 on the board for black, then Magnus bishop e2, getting his final piece into the game, that being the bishop on the f1 square, now on e2. Black goes bishop d7, and here Magnus Carlsen is ready to strike. He has all of his pieces, all of his minor pieces out. His queens and his rooks are all on good squares. He has to do something to increase the pressure if he wants to fight for an advantage and fight for a win. And here he does that with the move e4, breaking in the center, a brilliant move, a very common idea in the Queen's Gambit opening or the Queen's Gambit decline. Now here, black has a choice. If you don't take on the e4 square, then white's going to have the opportunity, say if he wastes the move a6, white's going to have the chance to go e5 either now or in the future. That would be extremely strong. So with that in mind here, he simply takes on the e4 square. D takes e4, definitely the best move. Now Magnus can recapture with either knight. In the game, he goes knight d takes e4, perfectly fine move, and black long castles. So here, Alireza Firouzja, he finally completes development. He finally gets his king to safety on the queen side. However, overall, Magnus does have a very large space advantage. Yes, black is relatively safe. Yes, black doesn't have too many weaknesses, but here, Magnus is definitely the one pressing in this position. Now here, he finds a very good way to increase the pressure. c5, gaining space on the queen side. Now, this is a very double-edged move. First of all, you are gaining space. You are setting up future ideas of expanding on the queen side, perhaps a4, b4, b5 ideas. And you do solidify your pawn structure, your pawns being a little bit safer now. On the other hand, the drawback of this move, obviously, it does give up that d5 square for the knight. So, Magnus is going to have to work through these imbalances in the game here. Now, Alireza Firouzja, king b8, getting his king to safety. Now here, Magnus has a choice. You can jump in with the knight to the d6 square, knight to d6. However, the problem with that move is if you jump in right away, knight d6, then black can simply go bishop c8, intending knight to e8 next, and from there, that knight's going to be chopped off, and there's not a whole lot white can do about it. So instead of that, in this position, Magnus takes the knight on the f6 square, knight takes f6, bishop takes, and then he jumps in with the other knight, knight to e4, again setting up more knight d6 ideas if he wants it. So interesting idea. Now here, bishop g7 is possible for black. For example, Alireza Firouzja can immediately go bishop g7, just trying to stay nice and safe and solid. However, that move is not necessary. It's a little bit passive. Honestly, in this position, white is not threatening knight takes f6. That would not be a very good idea. The knight being much stronger than the bishop right now. Instead, Alireza Firouzja, he finds a much better idea. Bishop to c8. You're basically undeveloping the bishop now that you've castled and got your king to safety. And this opens up the line of attack for the rook on the d4 square. So yes, the bishop is a little bit passive on c8, but doesn't really have a better option right now. And this allows black's pieces to be a little bit more active, putting more pressure on white's position. Now, queen c3 defends the pawn on the d4 square. And finally, Alireza Firouzja goes bishop g7. So a much better move order, sneaking in that idea of bishop c8 and forcing queen c3 from white. Now here, Magnus, he goes rook d2. The obvious idea, he wants to go rook hd1, further bolstering that pawn on the d4 square. And here, Alireza Firouzja, rook g8, a defensive move, basically trying to preemptively defend that pawn on the g5 square if he needs it in the future. I do want to point out there were some other options here for black. For example, one very strong idea, you actually can take on f4 in this position and then go h5, intending h4, gaining more space on the king side. So that would have been an option, would have been a very good way to counterplay. Instead, rook hg8, a more defensive idea, and this gives Magnus Carlsen enough time to increase the pressure in this queen's gambit opening. Here, rook hd1, doubling up those rooks on the d-file, obviously. Now, Alireza Firouzja, queen c7, eyeing that pawn on the f4 square. The threat now is simply g takes f4, and then after g takes, queen takes, jumping in with the queen. So Magnus, he sees it, queen to e3, defends the pawn, maintains the defense of literally everything in the position. Black goes bishop f8. There isn't a whole lot Alireza Firouzja can do here. Again, he's pretty solid overall. He has sort of a Caro-Kann style pawn structure here, and he's safe and solid, but there's nothing he can really do actively yet. So here, Magnus, he finds some ways to increase the pressure. Bishop f3 first. Then here, Alireza, he actually jumps out on the king side with the move f5. This is a very curious-looking move. He didn't have to do this. Instead, again, the idea of g4 trying to lock down the king side was possible. For example, you can go g4, forcing bishop b2. Then you can go h5, trying to clamp down on the king side. That would have been playable. Instead, Alireza f5, expanding on the king side, forcing the knight back. Now, knight to c3, and then finally bishop g7. Now, Alireza has this extra space on the king side. This can be very strong. It can also be a weakness. It just depends on how the game progresses. Now, here, the computer likes the idea of starting to gain space on the queen side with a series of moves like b4, potentially even a4, and then b5. The idea behind that is it's very, very hard for black to open up the position. Obviously, the only pawn breaks here would be e5, which is simply not possible. Maybe ideas like h5, h4, potentially, but again, that would only open up the king side, not the center of the board. So b4 was possible. Instead, Magnus goes for a completely different idea. Bishop to h5. This move is very strange. I mean, first of all, black can simply go g4, and the bishop is literally trapped. And then you have ideas like potentially queen to e7, potentially trying to eye the bishop in the future. Yes, for right now, it is hard to win the bishop, but that would have been a very interesting idea by black, g4. Instead, here, Alireza Firouzja just goes bishop f6, just defending, staying safe and solid, and Magnus goes a3. So this could be the start of a future b4 advance from Magnus, and beyond that, also giving the king a retreat square on the a2 square. So, solid idea. Rook g7 from black. And then Magnus, he finally tries to do something interesting. Knight to e2, trying to reroute the knight to a different square. Now, again, g4, once again, the best move for black. Black doesn't play it. Instead, g takes f4 on the board. And now g takes f4 for white. Now, white has finally gotten rid of those double pawns. However, the drawback is rook takes g2 is now a viable move. And black does take the pawn on the g2 square. So here, Magnus Carlsen willingly entered a position down a pawn, and it looks like black may actually be slightly better here, but Magnus doesn't seem to mind. He kind of likes this opening of the king side, because now after rook to h1, he's suddenly eyeing the h6 square, and he has a very easy way to increase the pressure. So, queen g7 defends the pawn on h6, but then rook d1, defending the back rank, potentially setting up rook g1 ideas. Now queen e7, bishop f3 hits the rook g6 retreats, and then we're going to see one of the ideas of this knight e2 retreat. Knight to c1, a typical Magnus Carlsen move. If you follow his games a lot, you know he loves these weird, undeveloping, rerouting ideas. Of course, the idea here, he wanted to bring this knight on c3 way over to the e5 square, and the way he's going to do it is knight e2 to c1 to d3, and then finally to e5. So very creative idea. Now, queen c7, king a2, kind of a waiting move. Black goes bishop g7, a little bit passive. And the problem with this move, it actually cuts off the rook's retreat square on the g-file. So, bishop h5 from Magnus hits the rook. Rook has to go somewhere. Rook f6, basically the only move. You don't want to get it trapped on the g-file here. Now, knight d3, continuing the plan of knight to e5. Typical queen's gambit opening idea. Now, rook f to f8, and finally knight to e5. Magnus finally getting that knight into the e5 square. And now look at that bishop on g7. It's doing absolutely nothing. It's biting on granite with that knight. For that reason here, Alireza Firouzja takes the knight on the e5 square. Bishop takes e5. Now d takes e5 for Magnus. And now look at this. Yes, black is up a pawn. He has that pawn on h6, but it's basically useless here. And look at black's pieces. The rook on f8 not doing much. The queen very passive, hitting the e5 square. The bishop on c8 doing literally nothing. This is just kind of a typical Magnus Carlsen positional bind kind of position in the queen's gambit. He loves to play these positions. Now black, rook d5, the idea being if you give Alireza Firouzja one more move, rook d8 is coming, and from there he's doubled up on the d-file, so Magnus not allowing it. Bishop to f3, forcing the trade of rooks. Rook takes d1, bishop takes, and then rook d8. Again, reactivating the rook, and now bishop b3. And now look at this position and how much has changed. The computer still says it's roughly equal, but look at this. The bishop on b3, so much better than bishop on c8. The rook eyeing the h6 pawn. Magnus even has the idea of later expanding on the queen side if he wants to. The computer says equal, but with my eyes, Magnus here is in complete control. All right, Alireza Firouzja, queen g7, eyeing the g2 square with the queen, trying to counterplay, potentially trying to go for an idea like queen g2, then rook d2, piling up on that b2 pawn. If he can get that in, he may have something going here. So, Magnus, obviously, queen to f2, stopping that queen g2 idea from black. Excellent move. Magnus never misses those things. And now, Alireza Firouzja plays a very controversial move. Very, very risky. a5. This move is technically not bad. It's playable. However, the problem, after a5 from a4 from Magnus Carlsen, that pawn is now permanently blocked on the a5 square. It can't move. And Magnus is going to have the option of queen to e1, trying to win the pawn in the future. So, Alireza, a playable move, but creating more and more weaknesses on the queen side. Now, rook d3 from Alireza, jumping in with the rook in his queen's gambit opening. Now, bishop c4 hits the rook. Rook d8, rook retreats. Bishop b3. Magnus sort of offering a repetition of moves here. Black can go rook d3, then bishop c4, then rook d8, then bishop b3. Instead, he's playing for a win here, believe it or not. Queen g6, a simple waiting move. And now queen to e1 from Magnus, eyeing that pawn on the a5 square. Black jumps in with the rook to d4, rook d4 on the board. But then queen takes a5, wins the pawn. And now here, Magnus wins back that one pawn he lost. And suddenly, the queen side is getting opened up. Magnus has the idea of queen to b6, then a5, a6, maybe even a7, trying to create all sorts of problems for black on the queen side. So what's black going to do? Queen g7. He tries to defend. Instead, the best idea would have been queen g3, trying to counterplay going immediately, perhaps following up with rook d3. But instead of that, here, queen g7 on the board. Now, rook d1 for Magnus. Not the best idea, but it does force out a mistake from Alireza Firouzja. Rook takes f4. That wins the pawn. But then, bang, rook to d8. Magnus pinning the bishop on the c8 square. The threat is bishop takes e6, and then rook takes c8. If Magnus gets that in, that is going to be absolutely lights out. Now, Alireza Firouzja, queen to e7, defending the pawn on the e6 square. However, again, very passive. Magnus, queen b6. The threat now is a5, then a6, maybe even a7, and then rook takes c8. And here, Alireza doesn't respect the threat. Rook to e4, a big mistake trying to win the pawn on the 5 square, but he doesn't see the idea in time pressure. Magnus, a5, pressing. Now here, real fast, if black wastes a move, let's say h4, trying to push the pawn down the board, very logical idea. Then the threat is simply a6, and again, if h4, a7, forcing the king to the a8 square, and then rook takes c8 is checkmate on the spot. So that's the threat. What can black do to stop it? In the game, queen to c7, trying to defend, but then Magnus Carlsen, he finds the finishing blow. And if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to solve this puzzle. It's a simple one, but very beautiful move. He doesn't respect the threat of trading queens. Instead, bishop takes e6. Brilliant move. The threat here is if queen takes, you simply go a takes b6, followed by rook takes c8, and the black king is trapped. He has nowhere to go. and that is game over. So for that reason, in this position right here, Alireza Firouzja resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen and his unstoppable Queen's Gambit opening. All right, diving into our fourth game here. If you made it this far, you are about to be rewarded because Magnus Carlsen is going to give a Queen's Gambit masterclass against Anish Giri, and this game was absolutely brutal. There is just something about Magnus Carlsen wiping the floor with Anish Giri with a brutal Alpha Zero inspired kingside attack that I just love. So maybe you'll love it as much as I will. Here, Anish Giri, of course, we have the Queen's Gambit decline with the 3 knights variation. Very key opening in the Queen's Gambit. Now Black has a choice. In the last 2 games, we saw D takes C4 and Bishop B4. Here, Anish Giri is going to go for the extremely popular semi-Tarrasch variation with the move C5. Now, this move has become all the rage at the highest level. Magnus Carlsen's even called it the Berlin defense against 1d4. It's just so solid. Here, Black's idea, he just wants to liquidate all these pawns and then get an equal game. Now, the strongest move here, and the one Magnus played in the game, is C takes D5. And now here, Black has 2 main options. The old move and the move Anish Giri played in the game is Knight takes D5. Of course, there is the alternative C takes D4. This is a very, very forcing line. The idea is after Queen takes D4, you go E takes D5. And yes, you do have an isolated pawn on the D5 square as Black, but beyond that, you have no weaknesses. Your bishops can come flying into the game wherever they want. You can castle. And it's very hard for White to prove a long-term advantage here. So this is why the semi-Tarrasch has become so popular at the highest level. But instead of that, here Anish Giri went for the older idea of Knight takes D5. This is really the original idea behind the semi-Tarrasch. Now Magnus, he goes for the strongest line, and we have a very long forced sequence of moves here. White goes E4, sort of in the spirit of the Grunfeld defense, if you're familiar with that. Now Black takes on C3, White takes back, and now we basically have a Grunfeld variation, the exchange variation of the Grunfeld, except instead of going G6, Black went E6 here, and that obviously has some very critical differences. Here, the best line for Black is you take on D4, White takes back, then you go Bishop B4 check, forcing the dark squared bishops off the board. After Bishop D2, you take on D2, White takes back, and then finally Black castles here. Now, this is the real starting position of the semi-Tarrasch with that move 5, Knight takes D5. Here, Black's idea, he has that queenside pawn majority, the 2 versus 1 majority on the queen side. That's going to be a very powerful long-term asset, especially if the game ever reaches the endgame phase. However, before that happens, White's going to have very brutal attacking ideas. And the simplest idea for White, and the one Magnus does in the game, you just go Bishop C4, then short castles, then get your rooks on the D1 and E1 squares, and from there try to make something happen in the center, potentially with D5, potentially an Alpha Zero attack, H4, H5. It really depends on how the game goes. So that is Magnus Carlsen's idea in this game. From here, Bishop C4, the best move. Now, Anish Giri, on the other hand, we know White's plan. Again, Rook D1, Rook E1, and then making something happen. Here, Anish Giri's best plan is going to be, in some order, Bishop B6, Bishop B7, then getting the knight out either to C6 or perhaps even better the D7 square, then Rook C8, completing queenside development, and then try to somehow trade off some pieces and eventually get your queenside pawn majority rolling down the board. So here, Anish, Knight D7, very solid move, Magnus castles, and Anish goes B6. So far, this is as standard as it gets. Now Magnus, Rook A D1, Bishop B7, and Rook F to E1. So this is the ideal formation that Magnus Carlsen wants in the semi-Tarrasch of the Queen's Gambit decline. The Queen on D2, the Rooks on D1 and E1, the Bishop on C4, eyeing the King. White's basically done everything he wants, and now he has to find some way of increasing the pressure. Before that happens, Anish Giri, Rook C8, finally getting his last queenside piece into the game, and pressuring that bishop on C4. So now here, the bishop's got to go somewhere in the game. Bishop B3, simply retreating. Now here, this is a very critical position for both sides, Black especially. What is Black going to do here? What does Anish Giri want to do to try and get some counterplay going? Well, he has a wide variety of ideas. One idea is Queen to F6, activating the Queen on the F6 square. From there, you potentially even want to go queen to f4 some point in the future if that's an option. Another idea is simply h6, staying nice and safe on the king side. There are no back rank mating threats ideas now. And beyond that, you are gaining control of that very important g5 square. And you also preemptively block the idea of h4 to h5 to h6 from white, which, again, may or may not be a recurring theme in this video, in this game especially. So stick around to find out about that. Instead of all these ideas, here Anish Giri just goes rook to e8, developing the rook. And beyond that, he may want to go knight to f8 to g6 at some point in the future. So a very good multi-purpose developing move. Also reinforcing e6, stopping bishop takes e6 ideas in the future. So solid idea. Now here, Magnus Carlsen. How is he going to increase the pressure? Well, one idea is the immediate h4. However, it doesn't work out as well in this position. Instead, Magnus has to do something else first. Now, d5 is technically possible, but then after e takes, the rooks come flying off the board, and white loses a lot of his attacking potential in this position. So, instead of those ideas, here, Magnus finds a much better idea. Rook to e3, the rook lift to the third rank. This move is super, super strong. We can see if the knight ever moves off the f3 square, Magnus will have rook to g3 ideas piling up on the king, or perhaps rook to h3 piling up on h7. And beyond that, Magnus also has the idea of regrouping with queen to e2 or queen to e1, getting some sort of mini battery going on the e-file with the queen and with the rook and the queen behind it. Now here, Anish Giri, knight to f6 is the move, trying to increase pressure on that e4 pawn. Very solid idea. But here, this triggers Magnus Carlsen. It literally triggers him on the spot to go for a brutal attacking idea. d5. This move is not what you think. If you're a beginner, you might be thinking, okay, Magnus is going d5, and after e takes d5, Magnus is just going to recapture with the pawn, right? Wrong. Instead of e takes d5, here in this position, he actually goes for the move e5. He's giving up that pawn on the d file. Again, going back real fast. d5, giving up this pawn, then going e5, hitting the knight on the f6 square. The idea behind this, now that bishop on b7 is out of the game, and more importantly, the knight does not have d5 to go to. So, for example, instead of that, if Magnus went e5 right away, then knight d5 is an option, and here black is dominating. His knight is a monster on d5. There are really no attacking ideas for white here. But instead, d5, e takes d5, then e5, d5 is no longer available for the knight. The knight has to go somewhere. Things are already getting super, super critical here. All right, where should the knight go? Let's go through all the options real fast. Knight to h5 is not a good move at all. Magnus can just go rook d3, and then piling up on that d5 pawn, and the knight on h5 is simply out of the game. So, knight h5, not an option. What about knight g4, hitting the rook on the e3 square? Again, not a good move. Then after rook to e1, Magnus can follow up with the move h3, forcing back ideas like knight to h6. And from there, that knight is going to be completely out of the game. So, knight g4, also not good. That leaves two good moves here for black. Knight to e4 and knight d7. I can't draw arrows. All right, knight d7. What's the idea? Putting pressure on that pawn on the e5 square. However, the problem is the knight is starting to get further away from the defense of the black king. And here, after queen to e2, white suddenly has all sorts of ideas. For example, e6 is a threat. White can also follow up h4, h5. And things are getting very, very dangerous. Now instead, here, Anish Giri, he plays the best move, knight to e4, jumping in with the knight to the e4 square, being supported by that pawn on d5, and beyond that, hitting the queen on d2 with tempo. So excellent idea. Now here, Magnus, he has to move the queen, and where's it supposed to go? Well, first of all, queen e2 is not a good square for the queen. That is a blunder. Then knight to c3 forks both the queen on e2 and the rook on d1. That would effectively be game over. Even Anish Giri is good enough to win against Magnus Carlsen in this kind of position. So, queen e2, not the move. Instead, queen to e1. Again, getting this mini sort of battery with the rook and the queen. And I realize this is technically not a battery. Usually you have the queen and the rook, or Alekhine's battery, but cry about it in the comment section if you don't like it. Moving on here, Anish Giri, queen c7. The idea being piling up pressure on that pawn on the 5 square and also setting up various ideas with the queen along this open c file. The other move, queen to e7, also possible. Again, both these moves, queen c7 and queen e7, very, very playable for black. So queen c7 on the board. Now, Magnus, how does he continue the attack and keep the pressure going? Well, first of all, that pawn on d5 here is vulnerable. It can be taken. However, it's not the best idea. If white regains the pawn in this queen's gambit opening right away with the move bishop takes d5, then after bishop takes, rook takes, and knight to c5, here that knight has access to the e6 square. It's going to blockade that pawn on e5, and meanwhile, black can get counterplay going on the open c file, perhaps queen c2 coming in the future, and here black is going to be just fine. So that is not the idea. Instead, in this position, Magnus finds a much better move. Knight to d4. This is a multi-purpose move. First of all, the knight threatening the f5 square. And Garry Kasparov, one of the greatest chess players of all time, once said a knight on the f5 square is worth at least a pawn. It's a monster, and that is definitely true here. So if white gets a knight to f5, it's eyeing the g7 square. White could potentially get a queen on g4, eyeing g7. That'd be scary. Beyond that, this knight also supports the e6 break. That could be very, very dangerous in the future as well. So knight d4, excellent move. Now here, Anish Giri, he's scared about the idea of knight to b5. Technically, that's a threat, but it's not very good yet. Here, Anish Giri goes a6, stopping knight b5 ideas. Of course, the threat would have been perhaps knight b5, then knight d6. But again, the knight on e4 already covers that square. This move was not necessary. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he plays my favorite move in the game in almost any opening, but especially the Queen's Gambit. The Alpha Zero move, h4, expanding on the king side. Here we go. Obviously, the idea here, first of all, threatening h5, h6, as we've seen in this video series so far. But beyond that, this Alpha Zero idea, h4, also cuts off the retreat square g4 for the knight. Now f3 is actually a threat. And again, if Magnus gets in f3, you can't go to g5, you can't go to f6, you can't go to d6. The knight is forced to go all the way over to the queen side on c5 or c3 or something like that. And from there, the knight is too far away from the defense of the king. And in that position, I mean, black will literally have no pieces defending the king side. So h4, brilliant multi-purpose move. Lots of ideas here. Now black, rook c d8, trying to, I guess, increase the defense of the d5 pawn. Black really doesn't have any active ideas here. The computer likes king to f8, but that move is incredibly difficult for me to understand. I think white just follows up f3 and business as usual. So instead, rook c d8 on the board from Anish Giri, a human-looking move, trying to defend, but then Magnus f3, again showing the idea of this Alpha Zero move h4, gaining control of g5. Knight g5 is not possible. Anish Giri goes knight to c5, threatening the bishop technically, but that bishop's not that important here. And Magnus just continues. h5, threatening h6 in the future. h6 can't draw arrows, and what is black supposed to do? Well, here, Anish Giri, knight to e6 is the move. Very logical, trying to get the knight closer to the defense of the king side. However, this just does not cut it. Instead, there's a crazy computer idea of b5, the idea being you want to go queen b6, and then this diagonal here is actually very, very weak for white with the rook and the king and the knight all lined up on it. That would have been maybe the only move to really stay in the game with roughly level chances or close to it. Instead, knight to e6 in the game. And here Magnus, he's like a shark in the water. He smells blood. He senses it. He jumps in with the knight. Knight to f5. That knight now eyeing the g7 square and also potentially the d6 square at some point in the future. Now Anish Giri, he fights back. d4, by far the best move here. If black doesn't play that, he's going to be in a lot of trouble. So, for example, if black doesn't play that, let's say he wastes a move. I don't know, a5. Then the idea for white, at some point, you can go queen to g3, trying to pile up pressure on that g7 point. So if black allows that, that's going to be incredibly dangerous. So instead, d4 on the board, Good move by Anish Giri. Got to give credit to Anish where it's due. Excellent move. But now Magnus rook e d3, further increasing the pressure on that d4 pawn. Magnus now has the three pieces, the rook, and the knight attacking it. What is Anish going to do? Knight c5, hits the rook, basically forces Magnus Carlsen's hand to take on d4. Rook takes d4, played in the game. Now rook takes, and then knight takes b3, trying to get rid of some of white's attacking pieces here. However, instead of taking the knight right away, here Magnus plays an excellent intermediate move, queen to g3, threatening checkmate on the g7 square right away. Here Anish has to respect that. He can't retreat the knight. That's going to be game over immediately. So, g6 on the board. However, this does not look good to me at first glance. Obviously, the white queen, the knight, the alpha 0 h-pawn, all piling up on this g6 point. This cannot be good for black. All right, Magnus, 8 takes b3, winning back the knight. And here Anish Giri, he makes the fatal mistake of the game. Rook to d8. What's the problem with this move? Well, here, Magnus Carlsen has a brilliant move that is going to shock you. If you like puzzles, try to stop right now and solve this puzzle here for Magnus Carlsen. It's a brilliant move. If you can find it, you deserve, I'm going to say 7 Happy Meals, my friend. That's right, 7. It's that good. All right, here, the winning move for white. E6. Unbelievable idea. You ignore the threat on the rook. You open up the attack on the queen. And no matter what black does, he is in so much trouble. For example, rook takes d4 doesn't work. You win the queen on the spot. Queen takes g3 is even worse. Rook takes d8 is checkmate because the knight controls the g7 square. What about f takes e6? Again, you lose the queen on the spot. Queen takes c7. That doesn't work. What is black supposed to do here? Anish finds maybe the best move, queen c1, putting pressure on the king on the g1 square. Then king h2. And what is black supposed to do? In the game, he takes the rook on the d4 square. But it's not enough. e7, threatening e8, promoting to a queen with checkmate. Anish Giri, he swings the queen back to the c8 square, defending. But then, queen to e5 with a double attack on the rook and the g7 square, threatening checkmate. And here Anish Giri, he tries one last-ditch move to defend. Rook to h4. The idea being here, Anish Giri is up an entire rook. Both sides have the queen and the minor piece. If here white takes knight takes h4, maybe black can defend. Maybe. But here Magnus Carlsen, does he take the rook with the knight? No, he does not. He adds the disrespect with the move king to g3, not taking the rook, keeping the checkmate threat. And here there's nothing that black can do. And in this position, he simply resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game. Now, in our last game in this video series here, Magnus Carlsen once again playing as white. He opens one knight f3, but very fast we are going to transpose back to a very aggressive Queen's Gambit opening with the move c4. Now, e6 from black, knight to c3, and so far in this video series, we've seen black play the Rogozin, we've seen the semi-Tarrasch, the Vienna, all sorts of lines. In this game, black's going to go for an all but very strong line, c6, the semi-Slav. Here, of course, black is getting that powerful pawn triangle in the middle of the board. And beyond that, he is threatening d takes c4. And if black gets that in without any issues, he can also try to follow up with move b5, trying to hang on to the extra pawn. Now, what is white supposed to do here? Well, there are two main ideas. One is the safer move, that is e3. That leads to the Moran or the anti-Moran. White's idea is very simple. Black was threatening d takes c4, so now after e3, the bishop can't recapture and white's not going to lose a pawn. Now, instead of that, here, Magnus Carlsen goes for the more aggressive option, bishop g5, immediately putting pressure on that knight on the f6 square. Now, in some lines, white can take the knight, but in others, he's just going to try to continue e3, bishop d3, and short castles and have a great game with the bishop outside the pawn chain. Now, here, black has a few different options to challenge white. There are more passive moves like bishop e7, or knight d7. There is the Botvinnik semi-Slav move, d takes c4. That leads to absolutely insane complications. I'll cover that in a different video. Let me know in the comments section below if you want to see that line covered. But instead, in this game here, Maxime Matlakov goes for the Moscow, anti-Moscow move h6, immediately challenging that bishop on the g5 square. Now, white has a choice. First of all, bishop f4, not a good move at all. If you wanted to play that, it's better to play it right away on move 5. Now, instead, here, white can take the knight on f6. That leads to the Moscow variation. Here, black is relatively okay after queen takes f6, but white still has some ideas based on his lead in development. Now, instead, here, Magnus Carlsen plays the most aggressive move possible, bishop h4. This is also a favorite of the computer program AlphaZero, and as we're going to see later in this game, Magnus is going to go for yet another AlphaZero attack with the move h4. Now here, what is black's idea? Again, he can play passive with the move bishop e7 or knight d7. Those moves are very solid. There's nothing wrong with them. But in the game, Maxime goes for the more combative idea, d takes c4. And now we're in for a fight. Here, white goes e4, gaining space in the center, getting those beautiful pawns on d4 and e4. Now black goes g5. This move is necessary if you don't play it. Let's say you play knight d7. Then white is going to go e5. And suddenly we have that pin on the knight on f6. The pawn's challenging the knight. And black's going to be in a lot of trouble. It's not game over. Black has resources like g5 immediately, but it is not good for black. Instead, here, g5 from black, the best move, cutting off the bishop. There's no more pin. The bishop retreats, and then finally the key semi-Slav move, b5, expanding on the queen side and hanging on to that extra pawn. Now, the battle lines are drawn here. White is down a pawn. Magnus Carlsen has to find a way to get compensation for the pawn, meaning he has to get some sort of initiative going, potentially attacking the black king. Meanwhile, black's goal is just to defend, get all his pieces out, and show that his extra pawn is more important than white's attacking chances. Now here, the most popular moves for white in this position are bishop e2 or knight d5. Instead of those, here Magnus once again goes for the most aggressive idea possible, h4, immediately starting an attack on the king side and trying to break up black's pawn structure on the g5 square. Now, what is black supposed to do here? Well, he has a few different options. First of all, you can defend the pawn, but that's very, very passive. Here, after h takes, white has the open h-file for the rook. Black can't castle on the king side, and overall, things already looking very, very bad for black. Instead, obviously, bishop e7, also not a move. White just takes on g5, then takes the rook on the h8 square. So instead, black plays the only good move, g4, defending the pawn and immediately challenging the knight on the f3 square. Now Magnus jumps in with the knight to e5. Now, of course, the threat is knight takes g4. White technically wins back a pawn, but there are a lot of lines where white does that, and the game goes on, and it's still very complicated. Now here, what should black do? Well, defending the pawn with rook g8 is possible. However, it is a little bit passive. Instead, Maxime Matlakov goes for the more combative idea once again, that is knight d7, challenging the knight on the e5 square. Now, Magnus has the option of taking on g4, but he goes for a stronger idea, bishop b2, developing and further increasing the pressure on the pawn. Now, again, black has a wide variety of ideas. For example, rook g8 is possible, knight takes e5 is possible, even knight to h5 is possible, trying to hit the bishop on h4 on g3, and then the queen is lining up with the pawn on the h4 square if it retreats. Instead of those, he goes bishop b7, a very typical semi-Slav move for black. And now here Magnus finally shows his hand. He takes on d7, black takes back with the queen, and then, bang, bishop to e5, hitting the knight on the f6 square, and of course the knight is now pinned to the rook on h8. Now, queen e7 from black defends the knight, but then Magnus, he officially makes this a gambit. b3. Magnus Carlsen trying to break up the pawn structure on the queen side at all costs. He's even willing to give up permanently that extra pawn on the queen side if black wants it with the move b takes, c takes b3, and then a takes b3. Here, Magnus obviously losing that pawn on c4 forever. However, in return, he would have terrific compensation with these semi-open c-files and a-files. Now, instead of that in the game here, black simply goes rook g8. He's trying to keep the queen side closed. If white takes on c4, black's going to go b4, again, trying to close the queen side. So instead, queen c2, very good move. In these anti-Moscow gambit lines, whenever you go queen c2, the typical follow-up is going to be rook d1, getting the rook on the open d-file. From c2, the queen supports the e4 pawn. It's a very strong setup. Now black, b4, Knight to a4 for Magnus, and then c3. Trying to lock down the queen side once again, but Magnus Carlsen is having none of it. a3. Magnus insisting on blowing open the queen side, trying to get some attacking chances. Now black, knight d7, getting the knight out of the way of the attack and putting pressure on white's bishop. That bishop on e5, that dark squared bishop is so important. So obviously Magnus is going to retreat the bishop back to the g3 square. There's no other good square on f4 and h2. It's just way less active, a little more passive. So now black, bishop g7, typical move, putting pressure on d4. Magnus goes rook d1, defending the pawn. Again, now we have that queen on c2 and the rook on the d1 square, as we talked about earlier. It's a very powerful setup in this anti-Moscow gambit line. Now here, black, a5, defending the queen side. Of course, the threat was a takes b4. Now the pawn defends. Magnus castles, and this is where the game really starts to heat up. Bishop to f6 from black. Here, black is putting pressure on that pawn on the h4 square, and Magnus does not have a good way to defend. For example, h5, that pawn's going to be lost sooner or later. Magnus has to make something happen right now. What should he be doing? Well, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now. Try to find the best idea for Magnus Carlsen. It's not a straight-up winning combination, but it is a beautiful move with an incredibly deep idea. You can find this. You may be a very stable chess genius. All right, here's the idea. You actually want to give up the pawn straight up, and you go bishop to c7. A brilliant move. The idea, no matter what black does, but especially if black takes the pawn, you go e5 with the idea of going bishop d6 in the future, and then that bishop is a monster, and black's bishop on h4 is cut off out of the game. Incredible idea. Now, in the game, Magnus did not find it. Instead, knight to c5 on the board, trying to activate the knight, putting pressure on b7, and basically forcing knight takes c5, then d takes c5. So that's what happens in the game. Knight takes, d takes, and here, before capturing that pawn on h4, Maxime finds a very important detail. He does not want to allow that idea of bishop d6. So, e5 immediately locking down the center here. He's going to follow up bishop takes h4 sooner or later, and bishop d6 no longer possible. So, brilliant stuff. Now, Magnus, rook d6, activating the rook. Bishop takes h4, finally winning that pawn. And now bishop c4. Magnus trying to increase the activity of his pieces here. Perhaps he wants to follow up rook d1 in the future. We'll see what else he has in mind. All right, black, bishop g5, getting the bishop out of the way. And now there is that threat of h5 to h4. And of course, the rook on g8 is lined up with the white king on the g file. Perhaps black could get an attack going here. We'll have to see what happens. Now, Magnus, queen d3. Very good move. We're seeing the idea of bishop c4 before queen d3. Of course, that's only possible without the queen cutting off the bishop there. So, excellent idea. Now, rook g6, black trying to get some pieces off the board. But here, Magnus once again finds a brilliant idea. f4, expanding on the king side, trying to open up the f file for the rook on the f1 square. Now, what is black supposed to do? Well, he pretty much has to take on f4 with the pawn or the bishop. They will lead to the same position. For example, if black doesn't do that, let's say bishop f6, that is just suicide. F takes e5, wins the game on the spot, basically. So, instead, he takes f4 on the board for Maxime, then bishop takes, and rook takes. So we're seeing the full idea of this f4 move from Magnus Carlsen. Now the rook lining up with that pawn on f7, and beyond that, look at his other pieces. The bishop also lining up, the queen and the rook forming this battery on the d file. If black ever takes the rook on d6, c takes d6 is going to be the move, and that's going to be an incredibly powerful pawn. And beyond that, look at black's bishop on b7 and his rook on a8 doing absolutely nothing. It's incredible how Magnus Carlsen always finds a way to get his pieces on such good squares, and his opponents never manage to do the same in these games. All right, here, Maxime, c2, trying to get some counterplay. Again, rook takes, then c takes is not a great idea. That pawn is just too strong here. So, instead, c2, giving up a pawn. The idea is after queen takes, that is forced. You can't allow c1 promoting to a queen. Queen takes c2. Then black can take on d6. Rook takes, c takes, queen takes. And here black regains the pawn. Now, I do want to point out, in this position, The computer says you do want to go queen to e5 before capture the pawn, putting pressure on the rook. If you don't do that, as Maxim did in the game, queen takes d6, then there's this idea of e5, sacrificing the pawn. This is what Magnus did in the game, and it's not really a pawn sacrifice, because if black takes the pawn, then bang, rook to e4, pinning the queen to the king. That is game over. You can't allow that. So instead, Maxim gives the check to the king. Queen to c5 check, hitting the king on the g1 square. Now king h1, queen to e3, hitting the rook. This is a risky move, as now the queen is further away from the defense of the king's side, particularly that f7 square. Instead, queen e7, likely the best move, but instead, queen to e3 on the board. Now Magnus, he punishes this mistake. Queen to f5, immediately pouncing on that weak f7 square. Now the king moves, and Magnus takes the pawn. Magnus with the vicious attack here. Can black defend? Let's find out. King c8. Then Magnus takes on the b4 square. A takes b4, and now a takes b4 from black is not going to be the move. It's just too slow. Here instead, queen takes e5, winning a pawn. And now here, the computer gives the absolutely ludicrous idea of b5. You can investigate that on your own. Instead, Magnus plays the more human-looking move. Queen to f8, hitting the king. King c7. And the rook flies into the 7th rank. Rook to f7, king forced to go to b6. Then Magnus takes on a5, b takes, and queen to e7, lining up the idea of queen takes b7, winning the bishop, winning the game. Now, Maxim, queen h5, he's fighting back, hitting the king. King's got to go to g1. Then rook to a1, delivering the next check. The king goes to c2. And by the way, instead of bishop f1, Magnus cannot go king to f2, because then g3 check is incredibly strong. Black almost turned the tables immediately. So instead, bishop f1 on the board, and now here Maxim. How does he defend the threat of queen takes b7? That is so incredibly difficult to stop. Here, Maxim finds the only good idea. He gives up the queen. Queen takes f7, a brilliant move. Here, shockingly, Maxim is still in the game. Here's why. He gives up the queen for the rook. Then queen takes, but here he has a follow-up. Bishop to a6, brilliant. Hitting the bishop on f1, of course, the bishop being pinned to the king. The threat is rook takes f1, and if all these pieces get liquidated, for example, rook takes, then queen takes, then bishop takes, then king takes, suddenly Maxim's going to have this 2 versus 1 pawn majority on the queen side. He may even win the game. So, of course, you can't allow that. Here, Magnus, queen to f2, hitting the king. King b7, and queen d4, hitting the rook, forcing the trade on f1. Rook takes f1, king h2. Now, material is technically even here. Magnus having the queen, black having the bishop, the rook, and the extra pawn on the h-file. However, Magnus is in complete control. The queen on the open board is much better than the rook and the bishop. Here, the queen can fly around every which direction, trying to fork different pieces. So, Maxim's got to be on his A game here. He starts h5, defending the pawn on the g4 square. But now queen c5, Magnus closing in with the queen, pressuring h5. Maxim, rook b1, pressuring b3. Now Magnus takes there, and of course, you can't capture the pawn right away. If rook takes b3, then bang, queen to f7, forking both the rook and the king. That's what I'm talking about, this queen being so strong on the open board versus the rook and the bishop. So instead, king b6 first, getting out of that queen to f7 check idea. Now the queen takes on g4, the rook takes on b3, and here Magnus won a pawn. It's now just a queen versus the rook and bishop, and Magnus has this passed g-pawn. His plan is simple. Just push that pawn down the board literally as fast as possible. Let's see how he does it. Queen g8, hitting the rook. Rook d3, and then g4. Then g5, and then g6. Magnus threatening g7, then perhaps queen to f8 and g8 promoting to a queen. For that reason here, Maxim has to give up the bishop. Bishop takes g6, now queen takes, and now here Magnus is up the queen versus the rook and the pawn of black, and black's only chance is to get a fortress. His idea is no matter where the queen gives the check, maybe his king can just kind of run around in circles and he's going to be okay defending the pawn with the king. Let's see if it works out. King c7. Now Magnus starts to give some checks. Then brings the king in. brings the king in some more, queen f8, and then Magnus's idea is to drive the king off the back rank. He actually wants the king closer to the middle of the board. So, queen b4, then drives the king in further, and here Magnus Carlsen is going to slowly force the king out of the back rank. So here, boom, the king being forced to c5. And now in this position, there's no clear win. Magnus Carlsen is going to slowly try to force out an unforced heir from his opponent. He's going to basically just make a bunch of moves in a row, trying to see if black is going to blunder a rook, blunder the pawn, give some sort of opening. So Magnus continues to press, continues giving the king some checks. More checks from the queen, more checks from the queen, even more checks from the queen. The game continues. And here Maxime, he's starting to get in time pressure. This game was played in blitz time controls. Queen f2, hitting the king. Rook to e3. Queen d2 check. And in this position, Maxim Matlakov loses on time. He loses the game. Magnus Carlsen wins. Wow, what a series of games in the Queen's Gambit. One of Magnus Carlsen's favorite aggressive openings to play as white, the Queen's Gambit. What a great opening. All right, Chess YouTube, that is it for today. What do you think of today's video? Let me know in the comment section below. By the way, if you like this video, smash that like button. It is the #1 thing you can do to help me out so I can produce more videos for you guys like this one. So smash that like button, subscribe, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, and I'll see you in the next video.